Great, welcome as all the participants are coming in. We'll just wait a moment while everyone's getting settled. Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Catherine Lining toko ingoa. I am a policy fellow at Motu Research based in Te Whanganui-a-Tara. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar, and I would like to open with a karakia. Poipoia te Maori, poipoia te Wairua, poipoia te Tapu, poipoia te whenua o Papatua Nuku. Today, we are introducing the new Guide to Just Transitions for Communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are very grateful that you are joining us today, and we're really looking forward to sharing our guide and the work that we've done to prepare it with you. For those of you whom we are meeting for the first time, Motu is an independent nonprofit research organization based in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington. We operate as a research cooperative, and we don't take an organizational position on issues or engage in advocacy. I also hold a role as one of New Zealand's climate change commissioners, but I'm participating in this project just in my Motu capacity. At today's webinar, we have invited several of the guide's authors to provide a brief overview of what's in the guide and offer some personal reflections on just transition challenges facing Aotearoa. We will be hearing from Janet Stevenson from Otago University, Marata Kafaru from Takarangi and Otago University, Crucial Watene from Auckland University, Trish Hall from Thought Partners, Will Allen from Will Allen and Associates, David Hall from Toha, and Troy Baisden from Motu and Te Puna Matatini. So here's an outline of the topics that we're going to be covering. We're going to reserve about the last 30 minutes or so of the webinar for a Q&A session with the panelists. So I'll start with just a few housekeeping matters. Since the beginning, this process has adopted the Te Punaha Matatini Code of Conduct for creating a safe, respectful, and productive space. And we will be carrying this into the webinar. If you would like to ask a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A function at any time, and the team will start lining up questions for the panelists. The recording and the slides will be made available on Motu's website after this presentation. We'll be covering why the guide was created, how the guide was developed, what are just transitions and just transition processes. Then we'll have the Q&A session, a conclusion, and some further information on where you can find the guide. So this guide was commissioned by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, and I'll turn to Kate Metcalf from the Just Transition Partnership team at MB for her introductory comments.
Tēnā tātou, tuatahi kei te mihi ki a koe, Catherine, te kaikarakia e tūkana te arawhata. Ka huri taku mihi ki ngā mana whenua o tēnā takiwa, tēnā koutou. No hikina whakatūtuki, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment ahau, no te tima o Just Transitions Partnerships, ko Kate Metcalf tōku ingoa. The Just Transitions Partnerships team at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment have commissioned Motu to produce this Just Transition Guide. I'm personally grateful to have had the opportunity to be part of this wider team of authors and advisors working alongside creative, thoughtful and compassionate thinkers whose wisdom will help us all navigate the greatest challenges of our time. So when we talk about just transitions, what do we mean? So a just transition is the process to manage change so its impacts and opportunities are spread more fairly. It's an inclusive process to create enduring, locally led and equitable outcomes. So under the Paris Agreement, Aotearoa committed to a just transition process when making the changes needed to meet our international climate targets. The Just Transition Partnerships team at MB was established in 2018 to support Taranaki with the transition away from oil and gas. We provide support for specific regions facing significant economic upheaval, energy shock and uncertainty. There's other work across government that you might be familiar with that aligns with just transition principles. For example, there's the industry transformation plans, which focus on a just transition for particular industries, and also the equitable transition strategy, which provides a just transition framework for Aotearoa as a whole. But everywhere, communities are managing their own climate transition. The Just Transition Guide provides practical tools and helpful case studies, which has been drawn from the experiences across communities. And many of you who are represented in the guide are also on this call today. So ngā mihi nunui kia koutou. The guide can be used by all communities to connect, plan, act and adapt, no matter how big or small the change. The guide outlines a process that is fair and just and supports oranga, well-being for all. It's been designed so people can pick it up and use what is most relevant to them and their communities. The Motu-led process for developing the guide was a bit like a just transition itself, inclusive, connected, and informed. The team of authors, advisors, and contributors reflect a broad range of perspectives and experiences, which has resulted in a richness that I hope will better support all communities. The intention is to continue updating the guide so it remains current and reflects what you, the communities, are saying and doing. The Just Transitions Partnerships team is looking ahead to other ways that we can help to connect communities so that you might learn and support one another. So kia kaha, please use the guide, share the guide, and feedback to help us improve the guide. Kei te mihi kia koutou katoa, kia ora.
Kia ora, Kate. Thanks very much for that. So I'll just briefly cover how the guide was developed. Again, in addition to being commissioned by MB and having core funding from MB, we also had co-funding support from the Aotearoa Foundation to help broaden research and engagement. And this was really important to us because we, as Kate has just said, we really wanted the development of the guide itself to be a just transition process. So we had a team of over 25 authors and advisors, including Kaupapa Maori researchers. I'll just briefly introduce some of our team members. This is our wonderful team of authors drawn from institutions and organizations across Aotearoa. And oops, maybe I'll just linger there an extra minute actually and let people see all of the people who've been engaged in this. People came from a variety of backgrounds, and it's been a fantastic process to get to know each other as a group and to reach out to everyone's networks across our authors. And in addition, we had a team of expert advisors and support with production and facilitation. And there are three people in particular here that I would really like to acknowledge. The first is Jonathan Burgess, who was our overall writer for the guide. He managed to bring all of these diverse voices into a single voice in the guide, and that's no small accomplishment, so really acknowledging his contribution. Katie Brown and her team at Social Good led the production of the design and the gorgeous illustrations with input from the Daylight Group. And I mean, the artwork is absolutely stunning and really captures these principles of just transition. I really want to congratulate her team on this work. And then we had Mary Jane Rivers, who helped us with facilitating our dialogue effort and held a fantastic space for helping to inform the development of the guide. But everyone in our team has worked incredibly hard to develop this, and I just want to send out a big thanks to everyone. In addition to the team members, we had an international literature review, a user survey, 5 cross-sector dialogues, and external peer review. And the dialogue process for this guide was really transformational for all of us as researchers. We ended up engaging with over 70 community practitioners and experts from across Aotearoa who were very generous in sharing their insights on the experiences they've had in their communities with just transitions, offering us suggestions for how the guide could be useful, and providing very constructive critical feedback on our first draft of the guide. So what we ended up producing landed in a good, useful place. This guide is really based on research and action-oriented. As Kate highlighted, we really wanted it to be a practical resource. It draws on tikanga and mataranga Maori and includes case studies of transitions led by iwi, hapu, and Maori communities, as well as others. We ended up with a selection of 17 case studies in the guide that illustrate different perspectives on just transition principles and practices in action. Now, they may not have been labeled as just transition activities by the participants, but we felt like they encapsulated the types of things that could fall within the umbrella of just transitions. I think it's really important to note here that the case studies may still be work in progress. Some transitions are never finished. Also, some of the outcomes may have fallen short of aspirations. But there is always value from the process. And we felt that these case studies were really important to include in the guide to help all of us learn. And we want to congratulate the participants in those processes for the progress that they did make. We'll be highlighting a selection of these case studies during the presentation. So this guide is really written for change makers in communities of all kinds, whether these are communities of place, communities of identity, or communities of interest. Users could include people in an iwi or hapu, community NGO or households, a business or a union, a government or educational institution, or an organization providing research or facilitation. But there are three important things that this guide does not do. First, it does not provide prescriptive outcomes for what just transitions should look like in communities. The guide is designed to help communities lead processes to create their own transitions. Secondly, the guide does not provide policy recommendations to central government. There are other processes underway for doing that. And third, we recognize that this guide is really an introductory resource and that more specific guidance may be needed for individual user groups in the future. So on this, I will turn over to Janet Stevenson.
Kia ora koutou. Ko manga tautari taku maunga, ko waikato taku awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā taku iwi, no Otipoti taku kāinga i nāia nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a real pleasure to be joining you today. Amazing number of people online here, and I'm going to do my best to represent the many people who've helped write this section of the guide or who gave insights and feedback and stories that have enriched it. So some of you may be worrying about the growing impacts of climate change on your communities. Some may be wondering about the impacts of low carbon policies for your business sector, or about jobs in an era of increasing use of artificial intelligence, or maybe how to restore the polluted rivers that your community used to swim in, or how to care for the people that you love in an era of increasing costs of living and increasing inequality. As a society, we're facing many challenges, and these challenges are all intersecting in some way. But I suspect you wouldn't be here today unless you are feeling the pressure of these and other challenges, and that business as usual is either being destabilised or is going to lead us down a path we don't want to end up. That we need to head in a different direction, and that you want to be working with your own iwi, hapu, community, business or organisation to drive your own transition. And at the same time, I suspect that most of us harbour the belief, or at least hope, that despite the upcoming changes, we have the opportunity to get to a good place, a place of positive outcomes, even if lifestyles and work are different to how they are currently. Societies have experienced major transitions in the past, and we can learn a lot from those experiences. Some have taken place over long periods of time, like the Industrial Revolution, or over a relatively short period, like the deregulations in Aotearoa in the 1980s and 90s. Some have had devastating and inequitable effects, like colonisation, and some have had beneficial effects, like women gaining the vote. Next slide, please. Could we go to the next slide? But the concept of just transitions is quite new, at least in the Western world. The phrase came from unions in the United States in the mid-2000s who were concerned about job losses as firms had to change to meet new environmental standards. It was then adopted by the International Union Movement, who called for a purposeful transition to an environmentally sustainable economy that contributed to decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. Since then, the phrase has been widely adopted to refer to processes of fundamental change across economic, environmental, and social systems. There are a few examples on this page. But importantly, the word just draws attention to the fact that these kinds of changes have the potential to be unjust, to affect some people or groups more than others, to more heavily impact those who are already susceptible to harm, to exclude some people from decision-making processes, or to ignore the impacts of today's decisions on future generations. So a just transition is one that is as fair and equitable as possible. In the context of Aotearoa, a just transition must also be guided by our unique history and the people of this place. As Merata and Crucial will enlarge on, a just transition in this country is also one that gives effect to Te Tiriti and incorporates Te Ao Maori. Next slide, please. Taking these ideas into account, in the guide we suggest that a just transition will restore and rejuvenate Māori life force to bring social, economic and environmental systems into balance. It will address injustices. It will be inclusive and based on shared principles, values and visions. And it will have outcomes that support oranga, well-being for all. So just transitions involve looking to the future, the past and the present. What kind of future do we collectively want to head to, taking into account the need to restore Māori, achieve balance and enable well-being? In doing so, how can we address inequalities from the past? And how can we make sure that the processes we use in the present are fair, inclusive, and that both positive and negative impacts are equally shared? The rest of the guide offers techniques for making this happen. Next slide, please. I've been asked we've been asked each to mention a case study, and the one I'm going to mention is very close to home here in Ōtepoti, Dunedin. I've had the privilege of observing and helping in small ways to support the South Dunedin community and Dunedin City Council over the past 7 years or so, as they've worked to lay the foundation for the future of South Dunedin. From an incredibly divisive situation back in 2015, when South Dunedin was hit by a major flood, the community now has a strong voice in its own future, and the council is working collaboratively with the community to assess its climate challenges and develop a pathway to a resilient future. One of the most inspiring things for me has been to see the leadership emerge from the community, forming the South Dunedin Community Network, which has connected up diverse groups across the area and worked to develop shared visions for the future. They lead a whole range of community building initiatives, such as the annual street festival and the 6-monthly community hui, and they are a key conduit for collaborating with the city and regional council in the South Dunedin Future Project. The South Dunedin community inspires me as to what is possible when a community takes charge of its own transition. In other work I do as a member of research teams that work with Māori communities impacted by climate change, I'm similarly inspired by the leadership as they draw their own people together to develop plans for the future, again, often working with other agencies. Even if none of these communities use the term just transition, this is what they're doing, collaboratively steering their own change, making sure no decisions are being made without them, and that no one is left behind. Kia ora, and I'm now going to pass over to Merata and Crucial to talk in more detail about transitions from a Te Ao Maori perspective.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnei atu nei mihi kia koutou o tēnei pōnanga o te tātukirau. Yeah, thanks, Janet. Yeah, so Crucial and I will speak on the Māori values aspects of the guide and how they can hopefully be helpful to you in a just transitions process. So I guess, though, firstly, the first thing to acknowledge is that the issues covered in the slides from a Māori perspective are pretty complex, and we will just touch on them quite lightly, but hopefully still giving you some ideas for the utility. So as we have here on the slide, the first one points to the idea that te tiriti, being one of the key foundations of our constitutional system, can also guide relationships in a just transitions process. So the main point here is that really it is important to understand what are the tiriti-based obligations between Crown and Māori? But there's also another question: how can other parties fit within that picture? This might apply to, for example, improving the health of freshwater and ensuring good engagement of local people. In this context, there is, of course, a treaty-based relationship, and there are also other local people and communities who have interests in doing something. Obviously, Cyclone Gabriel is a pretty major catalyst right now to come together to help address freshwater and, of course, many other issues. A just transition is about both people and environment, or tangata and whenua. It's about maximising opportunities and minimising impacts. Te tiriti is a papa, or a foundation to this thinking. Slide 2, please. So when thinking about just transitions and Te Ao Maori, the kupu, or the words just transitions, don't really come from our heritage. But when you think, what is it about? You actually realise that our people have been organising themselves, planning, or doing just transitions over generations. That's why our values can be helpful. So to take some examples from an earlier time. In peacetime, the economic cycle for a hapu involved decision-making around access to resources or knowledge about seasonal patterns and change, plus, of course, a whole lot of other stuff. Harvesting and distribution of resources were roles carried out to ultimately ensure group survival. Choices had to be made, like when to move camp, when to defend sites, when to share resources, when to exchange resources and decide with whom. Perhaps it was strategic to tuku or give use rights as well. The point was things were done from basically a kind of cost-benefit point of view. And in our kōrero or pūrākau and things like that, there were many stories about defending resources. And I can think of lots about kumara, and then figure out, okay, how are we going to get out of this mess, and who's going to get out of the mess? All of these were in some way about a just transitions process. That is to say, maximising opportunities and minimising impacts. And in conflicts, those are about more or less peacetime, more or less. But in conflicts like war, cost-benefit issues become much more sharply focused. The wrong decisions could cost you your life, and maybe that, with many others. Slide 3, please. So, decisions required good leadership, cooperation, good information, recognition of rights, recognition of responsibilities and relationships, recognition also of historical connections, and much, much more. It's this kind of thinking that can be useful today. And the values that relate to these points include mana, manaakitanga, kōtahitanga, whakapapa, and much more. So those are just some basic ideas. Now I'm just going to turn over to Crucial, who can talk a little bit about how some of these values apply in her context of her people up north in Kāre tū. Kia ora mai tātou. Next slide.
Next slide,
Passing
please.
over to Crucial.
Tēnā tātou, ko Crucial Wātene tēnei, I mihi atu nei he uri no Ngāti Manu, Te Hekatu, Ngāti Whātua Rākei me Tonga. And so just following on, just following on from what Merita said, of course, a central element to our just transition story is how communities on the ground can continue to bring these old and new values and ideas to life. So in ways that are informed by these values and also responsive to our needs and aspirations. What's wonderful is we're uniquely placed in this regard. We have kainga or marae communities woven through our land and waterscapes. And we're uniquely placed because given the practices of change and transformation and the philosophies and knowledges that underpin them, such as those that Merita has already described, since they can continue to play a role in guiding kainga and other local communities toward thriving socio-environmental relationships. So what we find is that many kāinga communities are on these journeys, and there's much that we can learn from them. In particular, though not least, that there are multiple pathways to flourishing. There are multiple pathways to flourishing. That we can be, and that we often are, at very different stages of our own journeys, and that's okay too. But that this remains a collective endeavour. So Ngāti Manu in the Kāretu Valley in Taitokero, and one of my communities pictured here, is one among many communities continuing to rebuild resilience and responsiveness in a rapidly changing environment. And there are many different dimensions to their continued work, including understanding and tracking changing ecological processes, building a range of partnerships and community capabilities, and also transferring knowledge and practice to the next generation. So ngā kaitiaki o te ahi pictured here brings all of this together by way of a multi-generational education program that's grounded in kaitiakitanga and practices of social and environmental care. By establishing on-the-ground initiatives and learning within tribal landscapes, ngā kaitiaki o te ahi, like so many other kāinga and marae community projects, are building leaders able to respond to urgent issues now while maintaining the long-term intergenerational thinking on which things like kaitiakitanga and leadership, and indeed our shared just transition story, will always depend. Kia ora mai tātou.
Kia ora, thanks so much for that. Having explored the concepts of just transitions, the remainder of the guide focuses on enabling community-led just transition processes. So what is a just transition process? Well, they bring together communities to take collective action shaped by shared visions and values supporting equitable outcomes. There are 4 stages that we've organized our work into: connecting, planning, acting, and adapting. These are not linear stages. Just transitions do not follow a tidy process. It's more of a chaotic spiral, but we thought that we could organize the content in the guide according to these themes, and we'll have different authors commenting on those. And I will turn to Trish to begin with the chapter on connecting.
Kia ora, Catherine, and tēnā koutou katoa. It's very wonderful to have a sense of so much interest in us taking action on just transitions. I'm going to speak and emphasize just a few of the points in the section of the guide that talks of that really beginning phase of connecting. And I'll also bring in a couple of examples or case studies of just transitions and particularly their lessons. So broadly speaking, connecting, this first phase, and it will be messy, as Catherine said, are those 4 bullet points. And I'm going to speak to them now with a few more emphasis on some of the messages. Thanks, Catherine. Next slide. So building relationships are critical, obviously, particularly in a transition that needs to work on what the very critical issues about what the next and future examples of how we begin to change the system. It requires energy and care to first build some understanding between people and organisations who might be involved. Trust doesn't come first. It grows over time from deepening understanding and beginning to do stuff together. But particularly understanding and trust are an ever evolving dynamic, and they need attention from those of us, all of us involved in just transitions throughout the phases. When you bring diverse people or organisations together, if you're stepping into leading a transition, go to others with a clear focus for the initiative. not a vision or a project plan already sorted. At this early stage, the leaders' role together is to explore the collective understanding of the transition's focus and each organisation's interest in it. Early discussions about the principles that will guide their work is critical for building trust, and Merata has mentioned some of those principles from Te Ao Maori, which no doubt will play a role. The way you gradually build a leadership group, I would say start with who you can and keep the leadership possibilities open to others as relationships deepen. How you create a vision and a way of working will probably need facilitation, both from leaders and at pivotal points from somebody external, a facilitator external to the just transition. Facilitation that is inclusive and supportive and cooperative really needs equal attention on the how the group functions, as well as the what they are achieving. Facilitators also help the group to hold the space open enough for new developments, new people, new possibilities. Care and support for those involved in the initiative takes time, commitment, and patience. One example I highlight here, because I know it has taken a lot of perseverance and a good outcome, is the Eastern Bay of Plenty Youth into Employment. A collaboration broker and facilitator has over years really encouraged organisations and people already working in youth and employment to join up so that bigger strides could be taken on the momentum that they are all wanting but can't achieve alone. And what we've learned from this example, that there's often reluctance at first. So if you keep committed as a facilitator, broker, influencer, and give careful attention to the diverse interests and the bigger goals, you can get some traction. Eastern Bay of Plenty region now has a high rate of rangatahi apprenticeships. As somebody said, one of the facilitators, Oporiki is apprenticeship central. So that was about the perseverance that's needed and the support and care, as well as in building support. You need to focus early on the fact in this early phase that there will be people who oppose your transitions, intentions, or actions. Others who are persuadable and the willing to join the action. Obviously, join up with the willing. Always keep the persuadables in the picture and keep talking with them about the overall goals. Keep in mind that the opposed may eventually, or with care, need to come on board or at least accept some of the transitional changes that you are beginning. So this way, across the life cycle of the transition, the just transition, support will grow. Let me just concentrate on a case study as my last piece with Wesley Community Action and Te Hiko. After working closely alongside whānau and families and hapori in Porirua, Hutt Valley and Wellington, the Wesley Community Action have learned that by facilitating and growing local leaders to take action on multiple initiatives, that the community can really identify where their well-being can be transitioned, enhanced. Lessons from these initiatives include facilitators who have that strong ability to draw out and amplify the strengths of people who have life experience. Give them the right support and development, strongly tautoko and link up their desired responses to others who can support them. Te Hikoi, the Centre for Community Innovation, gathers and shares the lessons learned from multiple of these initiatives. Take a look at it online and for some really rich examples of related multi-transitions and lessons. So finally, beginning a transition, since I was talking about this early phase, can be daunting. Start where you can, with who you can, always seeking to include some more members in the ecosystem of the transitions focus. I often think beginning begets courage. A refrain I continually ask myself and the leaders involved: what is it that this collaboration most needs now and next? And next, I'm going to turn over to that next phase that we identify, planning, and here Will come in. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, thanks, Trish. Kia ora tātou, ko Willelanaho. I was just thinking about Trish talking about daunting, and on the face of it, a lot of this does sound daunting. There's kind of so much to remember. There's actually so much we've written about in the guide. But I suppose on the other hand of it, it's all really just social. And when you start to think it's just about how to work with people, even the fact that we've worked with a whole lot of people writing the guide, it's the fun and the energy and the all of those things you get from working with multi-stakeholders and lots of people. So I'll just talk about the next chapter, planning, and touch on how we design processes, understand the system, but just talk about them in that sense of there's just a few key messages underlying each of those. So next slide picks up some of those key messages. And the first section, really designing transition processes, is all about the art and science of how we structure our collaborative efforts. Decision making requires a process that unites people by encouraging dialogue, building understanding, promoting collective action in the end. So it can be structured in so many ways, and in our guide we point to several models, each with its unique strengths and approaches. And I think the key message we want to leave is not to find the perfect one, or you won't find the perfect one, but rather just adapt from others to suit your community, your culture, and your aims. Next, we talked about understanding the wider system is crucial. We all love a quick fix, especially if it's presented with passion and eloquence. However, I think the key point here is the necessity of taking time to involve a wide range of people in our communities, each with their unique perspectives. It's really important to help all of those involved to express, understand, and acknowledge all of the different aspects of the problem or the challenge at hand. So it's creating that safe space and the time to really talk about the challenge whakapapa with participants. Developing a shared vision and values is crucial. We're not going to get anywhere without it, but then it's equally important actually to remember people, there's multiple goals and values. So any transition process, it'll engage individuals and groups with diverse perspectives, interests, aspirations. So the big takeaway here is there's no need to look for a single shared vision. There probably isn't one. Developing multiple visions for a desired future can help uncover shared and individual group values, ambitions, goals. And a collaborative can maintain a unified purpose without a uniform view, so it accommodates both individual interests and commonalities. And the last section in that chapter is thinking about how we can communicate our story. particularly the guide reminding us to communicate beyond the key people running the process. There's always going to be a lot of people on the periphery who could support or enable your work or actively oppose it. So communication isn't just about pushing out messages about what you're doing. If you're doing it well, your communication's building your allies, partners, and stakeholders. Just moving on to the next slide, and I thought I'd touch on something Catherine's talked about already. But any decision-making cycle needs a process that brings people together to make it happen and provide some structure. Regardless of how complex the challenge is, there's just a few distinct key phases that we have to cycle through, even if sometimes they run simultaneously. So you'll recognise the diagram summarises the guide chapter headings that we're talking to. We have a beginning or an ending, and then we have some iterative phases of planning, acting, and adapting. And the connecting in the middle reminds us that all of these phases need to be done with everyone involved, not to everyone involved. And finally, from me, next slide. There's so many awesome case studies in the guide, and one in this chapter that highlights different phases is the Lake Taupo one. This looks back at the original Waikato Regional Council initiated project to combat rising nitrogen levels in the lake, primarily from farming. And the case study talks about the strategy's 4 phases that emerged as they went along: conflict resolution, there's a problem and we need to get people together; analysis, engagement, and finally working through a regulatory process. And the project's been running for a long time now, and it's successfully secured government funding, slowed down the lake's water quality decline, and even led to the creation of new brands like Taupo Beef and Lakeman Beer, levering the narrative of saving a large lake. So with that, I'll pass on to David to talk about the next chapter.
Kia ora koutou. All David Hall toko ingoa. He tangata taritia hou no reira tēnā tātou katoa. So I'm here to talk about acting, which is where we make the shift from plans and intentions to actions on the ground into real change that people can see in their day-to-day lives. So next slide, please. I'll run through the key messages. So the first consideration really is who has the authority to make decisions? Who has the authority to make and enact them? One of the major dilemmas here is between, whether a decision process is done in a top-down way or a bottom-up way. When we're talking about top-down decision-making, we're talking about decisions that come from conventional authorities such as central government or even corporate executives and boards. And these top-down decisions can be very efficient, and the entities involved often have access to the resourcing which can make these things happen. But top-down decisions also have well-known shortcomings. Centralized decision makers don't necessarily have the right and relevant information, especially detailed information that comes from on the ground. And top-down decisions may also lack public legitimacy, buy-in from the communities who are affected by these decisions, especially if they don't have the opportunity to participate in those decision-making processes themselves or give their consent to the decisions which are made. And so there's a need and room for bottom-up community-led processes where key decisions lie with the communities who are affected by change. And so they can bring their insights, their experience, their knowledge into the decision-making process. But a key message to take away is that it doesn't need to be either or as well. There are ways to combine the best of both top-down and bottom-up processes where the capabilities and resources of conventional centers of authority like governments can be brought to the table, but also those on-the-ground insights and the social license that a community-led process brings. So that's authority. Another key element of taking action is to think through options, to undertake an options analysis, because we need to know not only what pathway we want to take, we also need to understand the pathways that we did not take and why we did not take those pathways. What were the shortfalls and shortcomings, what risks were there. And part of that options analysis is a feasibility assessment. We need to come to understand the technical, the financial, or the social barriers that these different options have. Some of these options simply won't be available to us, no matter how attractive they are, because of the barriers that are being faced by them. But if we do come to understand those barriers as well, that's the first step to overcoming those barriers and finding the technologies or the access to finance that can unlock that pathway as an option. This chapter also discusses strategies and action plans and offers various tools and frameworks for approaching these. A strategy is a way to formalize the shared vision, goals, and overall approach for the process, as well as measures of success. And it helps to identify risks and uncertainties and barriers. An action plan takes that down a level to the ground, to the actual decisions which are being made. What each action step entails, who has responsibility and accountability for those actions, who needs to be involved in delivering them, when will these actions take place, sets up milestones and also a sense of how long these actions will take, and also identifies resources which are needed to carry out that action. And that's the final message here, is funding and other resources, which is certainly a topic close to my heart, because this is where the rubber really hits the road, where we see who's really committed to enabling change, who's willing to put resources up to that change process. So it's not just, they're not just talking about it, they're actually walking the walk. Is especially relevant to my work today with Toha and the East Coast Exchange, where we're looking to facilitate community-led transition in Te Tairāwhiti after Cyclone Gabriel, and accessing funding to enable local ambitions and aspirations is a critical part of that process. Because transitions, at the end of the day, they involve a lot of time and potentially significant resources. And while we can and should involve the community's own voluntary action and their own intrinsic motivations, that's only sustainable for so long, because people have jobs to do, they have bills to pay, and so we need to find ways to resource these transitions so that they have longevity and capacity over time. To some extent, we can rely on in-kind contributions, where people contribute their time or resources or expertise for free, including entities outside of the community. And this is crucial for shoring up buy-in and support for that process. But again, this can be limited over time. And so there's also scope to bring in other sources of funding and financing, whether it's grants, cash transfers for which there is no repayment required, also debt where repayment is expected, and equity where investors take an ownership stake in the process. And certainly there's opportunities here for impact investment to commit to supporting transition processes. All of these different forms of funding and financing have their own risks and barriers attached, and so it's a matter of navigating through that landscape. And finally, I'll just talk to a case study on the next slide. The Land and Water Forum is a process which many of you may well be familiar with. It applied a consensus-based collaborative governance approach to developing a reform package for managing fresh water. It ran from 2009 for much of the next decade and drew inspiration from other forms of multi-stakeholder governance, especially in Sweden and Finland. So it brought together a number of different industry groups, environmental and recreational NGOs, iwi scientists, and other organizations who had a stake in that particular issue. One of its achievements was improving those stakeholder relationships over time. The process of deliberation and negotiation created greater levels of mutual understanding and an opportunity for all of these groups to be involved in striking compromise towards developing solutions. However, after some initial progress, many recommendations were not fully implemented because the power to implement those decisions did not lie with the forum, but did lie with ministers in the government at the time who chose not to take some of those recommendations forward. And that had the effect of undermining the credibility of the Land and Water Forum over time. So this is an interesting example where some of those issues around who has the authority to make decisions weren't sufficiently resolved. And we mention this case study because it's important that we not only learn from things that worked and from processes that worked, but also from processes that didn't work so well. So we can learn from processes like the Land and Water Forum about how to take transitions forward. And crucially, we can also learn from the transitions that we're involved in and undertaking today in order to inform adaptive management of those processes as they are underway, so that we can turn the dial and make them more effective over time. And so at this point, I will hand over to Troy, who's going to talk a bit more around adaptive management of that type.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Chesapeake te awa, ko Moosilauke te maunga, ko Cherokee te iwi, ko Troy Baisden toko ingoa. I've come as a scientist from the great environmental challenges of the Eastern US with a little bit of Cherokee whakapapa, and have been working in New Zealand for over 20 years. I'm going to talk to you about the final chapter of the guide that pulls many things together. And in bringing us there, I want to first emphasize this beautiful artwork by Ezra Whitaker Powley from Daylight, who worked very closely with Social Good to bring together the imagery in the guide. Here you can see that the image conveys a lot, and it reminds us of the scale and scope of the journey, which may be long and large. But it also reminds us of the importance of the people and the communication. It reminds us that we have to keep thinking about where we're going and how we're getting there together, and that's a process that may harness and redirect the inspiration and actions that happen through individuals and close relationships. We can evolve and flourish along the way and achieve the needed change that's beneficial for all. So what's in this chapter to get us there is first the philosophy that helps us imagine being agile and adaptive along the way, the concepts of monitoring and evaluation, and also a reminder that any transition may turn into another transition, or it may come to an end. It may need renewing. And so let's move on to the next slide. But keep in mind that everything in this chapter is really something that brings the rest of the guide together and helps us. If you were working through the guide, it's there from the beginning, but it's something to come back to as you begin to plan and act. And the first step that I want to talk about is sort of why we need adaptive. And that's, of course, because big transitions, difficult transitions, will always face a great deal of uncertainty. And so we can't always plan for all the things that will happen, whether they be events, political changes such as elections, and new policies that have come as a result of that. It may be storms that make a major change in how we use our land, for example. Those are all major sources of uncertainty that give rise to adaptive approaches. I mean, that plans that don't allow for uncertainty and also may have been built on people's prior successes that may simply be the ones that survived or made it through, don't always yield the best results. An important second step along the way is to make sure that it's not just about understanding the nuts and bolts, but how it represents the values of the people involved and the opportunity to stay true to those things and keep an eye out along the way. One of the most valuable things that I'll come back to as a case study is the idea that there can be guardians, not just of a place, but of the values and principles that underpin a just transition process. Continual improvement is part of monitoring and evaluation, and those flow into each other. I'll emphasize that once we get to evaluation, we should think about things being periodic, having the right level of depth. We can see good evaluation processes being time-bound, being systematic, but it's also essential that they're inclusive and that they really make sure that everybody has a voice at the table that should. Along those lines, it's important to come back to the values and principles and case studies that are in the guide, and initially presented as in a Te Ao Maori section, but then braided throughout the rest of the guide. Keep in mind that all relationships matter, but particularly those involving Maori, and delivering on expectations related to Te Tiriti are going to be important in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So then again, we come to that last point, identifying when to end the just transition process, when to renew it, and when to rejuvenate the leadership team is a really important part of thinking about that. So let's pop on to the Fiordland Marine Guardians case study. And this is a great example. There's so many pieces of the case studies in the guide that were hard to identify, but this one in particular represents something that really was a community-driven process that embedded itself eventually in legislation and has a panel of guardians that are appointed to look after the fjords in Fiordland. And so that provides a way of monitoring and evaluating what needs to change in the marine environment. Some examples of recent successes include biosecurity, real interventions associated with preventing cruise ships from bringing pest species into the fjords. And also, there's been a change to fisheries regulations in the area quite recently. So those are all things that are a result of not only having eyeballs, but relationships in place. At the same time, I would emphasize that monitoring isn't just eyeballs. The Guardians group would emphasize to government that there's a need for more formal research with real funding going forward, especially with the threat that climate change poses and the changes associated with that. We've also got a major research program there that's a major outcome of having that process in place. So imagine beginning in 1995 and having a major research program that I in particular am involved in, but it looks at the carbon cycle of Fiordland 30 years after the initiation of this group. So getting started can have big implications in the long run. I'll emphasize to everybody there's a question and answer period coming up. So if you start getting your questions into the Q&A, that will help everybody. And I just want to talk about one more thing, which is sort of my insight, something that we can all think about and remind ourselves of the challenge of climate change with as well. So the Guardians are primarily about looking after the environment as it's existed. We can think about the challenge of climate change and the transition ahead, perhaps with energy in our communities, and think about cases like in the UK, where they've taken a major step to put offshore wind in place. Well, I was just reminded through some things going on in the last week that this is a great example to think about how we can renew processes towards the transitions we need, because when offshore wind was first proposed, it was pilloried by some economists because the marginal costs of the first few windmills were enormous compared to some other options, particularly the clean energy options, such as burning biomass or wood pellets. But 10 years later, and the marginal costs of building each new offshore wind farm were very low, lower than opening up new gas fields or other fossil energy sources. And that is the goal of things like the Inflation Reduction Act in US policy. These are things that can bring business and government and communities together to ultimately reduce the ongoing cost of energy to people and put the savings into our communities. So that's the kind of thing that monitoring can help us focus on, because in that case, they knew the ultimate goal was to reduce the costs in the long term. and take the inflation and risk out of the energy economy. It runs our communities and allows them to get to work through transport. So with that, I'd like to conclude by noting just two more things. Those are starting points of our summary of the guide, but there's wonderful references throughout the guide and many more in the annotated bibliography. We conclude the guide by wishing you and your community all the best on your transition journey. Ngā mihi nui, and now I'll hand off to Emma from Motu, who will run the question and answer.
Kia ora tātou. I have a question for the Kaupapa Māori team. The guide features the importance of Te Ao Māori values and principles as they exist on the marae. How does this work in practice when engaging with Māori in business and government?
Might be able to have a response that answers that question. Kia ora, I'm Sean Awatere. I'm with Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research. I was advisor to this process. I think that's a really good question, particularly with respect to thinking about it in terms of how you might approach it in terms of regional economies or a catchment-based approach for dealing with an issue. So, for example, if we look at Te Tai Rāwhiti on the East Coast and the impact of some of the land management practices that have had on the environment and on people, as highlighted by the Land Use Inquiry report. What that suggests and what the recommendations come through is that you need a collaborative approach between local government, hapu, and sector in order to identify what might be the approaches that that sector or industry ought to look at. But I think the answers need to come from that bottom-up approach, and at the same time, people are resourced to participate in those approaches as well, so that their way of thinking or their priorities are reflected within the plan that provides guidance for how that catchment is managed, and we don't go back to a business as usual approach.
Sean. So then a follow-up question is, what challenges did the Kaupapa Māori team face in braiding Te Ao Māori through the guide, and what has made this worthwhile for you?
Kia ora, I'm happy to have a brief comment around that. It is always very difficult to say this is the set of matapono or values, but at a certain point I could say that there is a collective understanding that these are some of our key values, and they can be applied all together, separately, or with other values that are relevant to the particular community that may be under question. I'd just like to go back to Sean's comment and also the value of a bottom-up approach. There are so many things going on in this country at the moment, and I acknowledge that some of those are top-down and some of those involve large organisations, including businesses. But at a certain point, what this transition booklet does is consolidate some of the work that's been going on over several years in so many different communities. And if there's one thread in this, which values absolutely reinforce, is that collective ways are required. And the collectives may be industrial collectives, they may be regional collectives, rural collectives, and mixes of all of the above. And something has to start the process, and something has to make it work together. So in terms of transitions in rural communities, it's a very tough time economically. It's very hard to think beyond the next paycheck or your next price from Fonterra, and yet that is exactly the sort of thinking that is required and has to be held with some sort of glue. So those values are a starting point, they're not the end point. It it's not even a pick and mix. All of those are going to be important at some point, depending on which time of the transition or which part of the process you're involved in.
Kia ora, Katharina. This is a question for David. This guide favours taking a bottom-up approach to transitions. Would you be able to reflect on the risks and challenges with bottom-up approaches when those who caused and profited from injustices aren't held accountable, and the costs of transition are passed on to those with the fewest resources?
Yeah, kia ora. So yeah, I did say this is an issue that's close to my heart, because I think the distributional questions and how these things are funded and financed are critical for this. And part of the way that they can be financed indeed is through applying polluter pays approaches. Indeed, in the case of climate change, I should say that this guide is not specifically about climate change. That is just one of the low emissions transition is just one of the possible transitions that we're talking about in this guide. But certainly when you do focus in on climate change and the low emissions transitions, polluter pays approaches are one way to address this particular issue. We have that through the emissions trading scheme, and some of the revenue from emissions pricing is redistributed back to initiatives that can address emissions. And so certainly that is one way to address this issue. But I think it really speaks, and I was actually giving a talk last week to the Government Economics Network on exactly this topic, that we currently have a lot of power sitting with government and with large companies, and this guide is very much about emphasizing social power and the power that can come from communities, and ultimately which large companies rely on for their social license to operate, and also governments rely on for they rely on voters and electorates to provide their consent to be governed. And so if social potential is undermined, then it can undermine the legitimacy of economic and state power as well. And so I think that there's a strong interest in rebalancing that imbalance at the moment, giving greater power to communities and the regions. And certainly one of those ways to redistribute power is to redistribute resources and to find new ways of funding and financing initiatives where those investors, whether they're private or public, take a bit more of a risk on the regions and on local communities, that they will fund and finance their aspirations rather than controlling how that money is spent from the centre. So I think there's a big shift here that needs to happen, which is why we're focusing here on the communities, because I think that's where some of that power needs to be expanded and strengthened and encouraged.
Kia ora, David. This is a question for Trish, please. From your experience, what is the most important thing you can do to ensure positive and constructive collaboration?
Great question. Very hard to answer the one thing, but here goes. Collaboration really involves getting inside and understanding the others and their interests, their strategies, their aspiration. And by really being able to spend enough time to understand others' aspirations and their interests in potentially being involved, and being able to talk that through, even when there's a little bit of rub between them. I think that is a key point. And the other is to really have a deep commitment to keep looking at the process of how we're working. I notice this is easier said than done when you have particularly government, central or local, who are dedicated to good project planning and getting results quickly. So this sort of tension of spending longer at working on the collaboration and then working on what it is you can do together. Of course, it's not linear, but it means doing some really hard talking inside organizations who would prefer quick fixes to talk about what a more systemic approach would mean. And I think this is changing slowly. Of course, there are places for some quick fixes that the community can also be engaged in. Anyway, that's a starting point, a really important question, but I've answered it with a number of levels there, so not the one thing that you can do. Hope that's sufficient.
Kia ora, Trish. There's a follow-up question for you. As someone who works in resource management issues, these processes can work well, but require significant investment in those initial connecting activities you spoke about. Some organisations don't understand the value of investing in connecting like this. Do you have any advice to help me to convince them of the value of investing in initial connecting activities?
Yep, this is a very good question. I sort of began to open my response there when I spoke just before about project management and quick fixes being a key mindset of many more institutions, and showing action quickly. And there may be some things that by involving those who wish to be involved in a longer term transition, there may be some things that could be of value and be done in the shorter term. But most importantly, I think, is the education of people who work in, say, resource management, in holding both longer term transitions and being able to work on things that can be done in the shorter term, but also educating, influencing their own managers, their own leaders, and the political processes, that these things do demand that we draw out from communities in order that these be just transitions. Okay.
Kia ora, Trish. This is a question for Katharina. Katharina, do you have any advice about how to connect with collectives and identify leaders to kickstart transitions?
Kia ora. Well, look, I think leadership comes in many shapes and forms, and sometimes it's not the most obvious people that are the leaders. Often it is a person that just gets stuck with it. They end up being the leader. So could someone in our case, it's like, oh, is there someone who'd be interested? So I'm talking about my marae here. Is there someone who might be interested in this, that, or the next thing? And if you put your hand up, you're the leader. So I think that's the reality for many small organisations. In terms of larger collectives, there are going to be nominated people. So for example, I'm thinking of a leaders group where there are a number of different committee where there are identified leaders. So those are the obvious people to talk to. But when you're talking at a smaller or regional level, from a Māori perspective, there are definitely going to be people who have particular interests and roles, and they will be the people who, because they turn up, are the leaders, and then they will be the people who will bring on others, particularly rangatahi and young people. In our marae, that's always a search for us to say, who are our rangatahi? And I want to acknowledge Crucial here, whose slide showed that there were kaumātua there or kuia there, and there were rangatahi there. So, you know, that 2 or 3 generational leadership is often what we're looking for.
Here's a question for all panelists. What is your #1 piece of advice for people beginning a just transition process? Anyone want to speak to that?
I'll start off just to kick off the discussion. From my experience of writing the guide, it's to really take the time to understand the needs of all of the different people that are involved, and to try to bring as many voices as possible to the decision-making table. I think once we bring all of the voices into the conversation and really take the time to understand the needs, then I think the solutions that will actually work present themselves. I think we've been in a cycle of having underserved and underrepresented voices not being served in decision making. So I think that would be my starting point, and I'll invite other panelists to respond as well.
I would just add the importance of just getting started and actually doing things and taking a learning by doing approach, because it's all very well to sit in the background and try to anticipate the sorts of barriers and connections which might emerge, but there's nothing like actually moving in the world and making those connections and being surprised by who joins you and what resources come flowing because people join in with the aspiration. That's me.
I'd just add that I think right at the start, it's really important to reach out and get a common understanding of what is the challenge that you're actually talking about, because as maybe someone who's concerned about an issue, we may, you know, enter into conversations with other people in the community thinking that's the issue that's important to us and therefore it's important to everybody else. I think listening to me is really important, using your ears, having conversations, finding out what concerns other people and why, and where the overlap is, where the common ground is, which then forms the basis for action from there on.
Yeah, just adding to what everyone said too, I think we often think about the transition as trying to solve the energy problem or the water problem, but when we're starting these processes, it's often quite good to say, well, in the next 2 years, we're really going to do what panelists have just been talking about. We're really going to get this sort of level of talking across all the people. We're going to kind of look at some intermediate goals that in 18 months to 2 years, we're going to have better quality partnerships, information on things we don't have, that we're going to know that we've got the leadership and capacity to engage. So it's just realizing these are longer term processes, and they're not about the first couple of years is not necessarily going to provide you the answer, but it is going to provide you the basis to run collective processes better in the future.
I might hop in on that one as well, just to say that one of the parts of the Taupo case study that didn't make it into the final guide, but really emphasizes the value of this listening and working with people process and starting to work through what action looks like and being serious about it, but not too fast about it, was the word that Tony Petch, who was sort of the architect of the meetings in the community, he emphasized that he was trying to find the coincidence that pulled everybody's goals together. So it was a process of listening. Another way to think about it that's not just listening is perhaps to make it sound better by calling it quiet leadership.
I'll come in there. In addition, I think there are I totally agree why others have said, I think there's sometimes an opportunity to do something together that will create learning and will also create something that is more straightforward to begin with. I don't know, have a planting, take a piece of land and replant it in the process, and this is just one example, in the process of us also deciding what the focus of the transition is that we're wanting to work on. So yeah, sometimes there can be some short-term actions that we learn from, just as David was emphasizing too.
I was just going to add in there. So my piece of advice would be to just be innovative in terms of looking at the solutions, look beyond the current economic framing and think, what do actually communities want? The case studies are showing that people want to be more connected to the environment. People want to ensure that some of those negative externalities that are generated by business as usual approaches are mitigated, and that we transition to practices that are going to be better off for intergenerational benefits. So yeah, don't be fearful, don't be afraid, and embrace a change for the benefit of the next generation.
Yeah, I might just add a little bit to that too, exactly that. Don't be fearful, be brave, be bold, and it might mean also taking a team leadership approach. So you're having different kinds of leaders that collectively work together. So that idea of kotahitanga is important there too, which also means then you have to have maybe a kind of open-mindedness and patience and being prepared to listen to others so that you do come together in the end with that collective view of mutuality.
Kia ora. Here's a question for all panelists. Several speakers mentioned the importance of ensuring that all partners and stakeholders and collaborators are resourced to participate right from the design stage of a just transition process. But how sustainable in the long term is a process that is so dependent on external funding?
Maybe I'll take a first approach to that, and other people are welcome to chime in. This lack of funding for getting started up front was a huge barrier that was identified by many of the participants in our dialogue process. And I think some of the measures that David Hall referred to, maybe we can recycle ETS revenue or create new funding streams to support this kind of activity and to help get it started. From the experiences we heard from throughout the dialogue process, there were processes that were able to raise funding, whether it was through central government or from local businesses or from iwi, to get an initial process started and to come up with a shared vision and a strategic plan. But then securing the funding to actually implement the plan and monitor it over the long term was another hurdle. And some of our case study communities are still struggling with how to do that. So I think this represents a paradigm shift, and it has to be represented in new funding models at central government level, local government level, and thinking about how businesses, philanthropists and others could also contribute, because I think the value of doing these processes is huge. There's a very large return on investment, but we currently don't have the funding streams to support it properly. But interesting to hear if other panelists have further insights.
I might pop in to offer an insight that is also really important and relates to this topic, but is broader. And that is that we often were criticized in writing the guide that we didn't offer a tick list or a single plan of how to do things. And this is a good example. There's no single way to fund what's required to achieve a just transition, but it is extremely important that funding and resources be found to support the people that are involved.
Yeah, I might add, I agree, Catherine, that we need to explore different ways of funding and financing things, and that might even include, as I mentioned, equity and opportunities for impact investing, because if some of the process is driven by things like social enterprises and environmental enterprises that have a, internally sustainable business model themselves, then they can generate their own revenue streams and continue, but that's not going to be appropriate for everything. And so I think there is this need for how to unlock traditional forms of funding, including public funding and so on. And I think one of the issues there is in the background around how we evaluate the costs and benefits of these sorts of processes, or how we don't fully evaluate and analyze well the costs and benefits, because you know, traditional frameworks for cost benefit analysis do tend to focus on financial costs and benefits, and to neglect some of the social and environmental benefits which these processes are aiming to maximize. And so there are important conversations around how we make those decisions and what sorts of frameworks we use, and whether we need to supplement cost benefit analysis, which can be quite narrow and short-termist, with other frameworks for decision making, which are better for long-term decisions, and especially decisions in transformative change, and which are better able to grasp the risks and opportunities of transitioning or not transitioning. So yeah, so just to sum up, it's not necessarily just about funding flows, it's also how we make those decisions around where to invest and where not to invest.
Yeah, just to add to that too, I think it's, when we're facilitating, it's really important to get everyone there, and that's that bottom-up processes, and there is a real lack of funding for that. But at the same time, when I've been in longer term processes with, say, farming communities, runaka, runanga, there's often a tendency for people involved in the latest transition process to call everyone together at the bottom, and your farming community can well come to you and say, well, we've been talking with you for 5 years, you should be able to, you know, put our views out there for a start. And so I think there's an onus to seamlessly start to integrate this in a more collaborative way, rather than to look at every process as requiring X number of dollars to get started.
I'll just highlight briefly that the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment has developed a resourcing page in its Just Transitions section on helping to finance just transition processes or fund them. And there's a link to that in the guide, and you can also find it on MB's website.
Kia ora. We have another question for all panelists. What role can professional communities have in just transitions? How could communities like Engineering New Zealand or the New Zealand Planning Institute use the guide to lead equitable system change in sectors that cover the whole country and are not locally place-based?
I might jump in on that one, since I am actually also co-president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists, and point out that these processes aren't just entirely led by those societies, but there is a government process by another group agent, part of MB, called Te Ara Parangi, which is effectively trying to undertake what could be considered a just transition for the research, science, and innovation system. So research communities can be involved in asking for that and helping make that a just transition once a major reform gets underway.
I could add a little. As someone who has facilitated dialogues with New Zealand Engineering New Zealand on some of the big issues that face us, this is a few years ago, it seems to me that absolutely as professional associations have a role in being connected to the just transitions and learning what are the issues for the people involved, and then thinking, how could we run some parallel and keep involved parallel process with our own members and build partnerships across other professional associations or other organizations who are dealing with the big issues like, I don't know, earthquake strengthening, like quality of infrastructure. So there's my piece.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. I think we'll need to conclude the Q&A session there in the interest of time, but we really appreciate all the questions that have come through, and if we didn't have the time to address your questions today, we will make a note of them and try to reflect on them in future work. So thank you very much for sending all that through, and thanks to all of our panelists for your responses to the questions. I'll just move toward a couple of concluding remarks. I know people will need to get on with their afternoons. As we've written in the guide, just transitions really enable communities to develop positive visions for change, transform unfair systems, draw on diverse strengths and worldviews, and come together to solve problems in ways that work better for everyone. And as with every process of change, we have to start from where we are. And that means acknowledging past and present injustices, as well as trying to prevent those that might unfold through disruptive changes that we're facing. We can also start each process with fresh hope that we can learn from past experiences, whether we judge them as failures or successes, and find different and better ways to move forward together. I wanted to conclude just with a brief story that I had found while preparing the guide. In a 2015 lecture to the Maori Law Society, Justice Joseph Williams shared the story of Nainoa Thompson, a Hawaiian who wanted to use the old ways of Polynesian navigation to sail 4,400 kilometers from Oahu to Tahiti Nui. His Micronesian teacher had learned from his grandfather, and after 2 years of training, the teacher took Nainoa to the bottom of Oahu and said, "Now can you see your island?" And of course, the island was below the horizon and Nainoa couldn't see it. So the teacher kept repeating the exercise. And on the 4th night, Nainoa closed his eyes and he finally saw his island. And Justice Williams said, on such a difficult journey, if you are a true navigator, and I interpolate here, a true radical in the way that Kupe was, then unless you have the island firmly in your mind, the waves and the storms will distract you so much that you will lose your way. The more radical the journey, the clearer the island image has to be. With Just Transitions, we're trying to find a new island together. And thank you so much to all of the people who have contributed to preparing this guide, our team members, advisors, dialogue participants, and peer reviewers, and to all of you who've taken the time to join us today and who are working so hard in your communities to make Just Transitions a reality. This guide is only one contribution toward the efforts that are already underway by many, and we really hope that this guide can help shape and expand the community of practitioners doing this work across Aotearoa and overseas. The guide is available to be read online and can be downloaded from the website of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And the guide, as well as some supporting materials, are available on Motu's website, and that includes an annotated bibliography, a more academic paper on just transitions, and eventually there'll be a paper on what we've learned from the dialogue process. So those additional resources are available from Motu. We really hope that you'll find this a useful resource. And I will close with a karakia. Haere I roto I te maramatanga, haere I roto I te rangemarie, tuku a tō wairua, kia tō te rangemarie, kia tatu katoa, ho pai marire. Have a really good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again.